premeds need to be aware of the reality of medical school versus the idealistic nature that gets put out there a lot. How come premeds aren't told of the high suicide rates in this profession, and what exactly are they?
Medical students and physicians are dying by suicide at 2 to 3 times the rate the general public. We do not have accurate data because it's a taboo topic even beyond medical culture. It's just shocking within medicine that we would be sweeping this under the rug. Essentially, premeds are not getting informed consent about what they're signing up for and the mental health risks that could lead to death in a professional career. You should understand, kind of like with the military, you understand you could be killed. To keep young, naive humanitarian students sheltered about the real mental health risks is a huge disservice.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's even higher than lawyers and other high demanding professions, I believe, right?
Hard to say. I have over 1,600 on a registry that I've collected where I've analyzed them from gender to specialty to method of suicide. Now I've been able to crunch the data. I think for the first time, nobody's taken this level of interest and really parsed it out by specialty. Male anesthesiologists are the highest, then surgeons, then emergency docs. People really need to understand this because some people who go into medicine have pre-existing anxiety or depression or maybe had a suicide attempt in high school. Shouldn't they know when they're heading into a specialty that they could be putting themselves at risk?
100%. They should be aware of that. And I also think that people need to be aware that even if you don't have a prior history, you might end up developing it. Because I know of one person, a classmate of mine, who told me he was feeling suicidal after the end of the first year of medical school. And that was kind of like a wake-up call because I don't think people understand the rigor of the profession until you're actually in it after your white coat ceremony.
Exactly. For most people, they've never had pre-existing mental health conditions. They come into med school wanting to help and heal others and then find themselves depressed, anxious, suicidal, having panic attacks, and not being able to get the mental health care they need in a non-punitive, confidential manner.
Culture of medicine values the sucking up mentality. We're told medical students tend to get screened for how much grit they have, how much resilience they have. So you're expected to have those characteristics entering into the profession, but it feels like once you're in training, they take it to an extreme, which causes, I think, physicians and medical students and residents to forget about their own well-being. So how come it's such a problem asking for help when you're dealing with sleep deprivation, all these things? And why is there such a fear of asking for this?
Medical education is rigid hierarchy, our way or the highway mentality. There is this sense that if you can't keep up, you're weak. So then there's Stockholm syndrome with the people who've been through this before that just are like, well, I made it through, so you should be able to make it through. The scenario is one of human rights violations. It should be absolutely illegal to work anyone in residency 28-hour shifts. The ACGME has allowed residents to work 28-hour shifts, 80-hour work weeks, and a lot of residencies don't even respect that work hour cap, which that is like 2 full-time jobs, 80 hours a week. And some residents contact me, they're working over 100 hours a week. So this should be absolutely illegal, but the organizations that police within the medical profession are leaving us in harm's way as trainees. That leads to a certain amount of hopelessness and death even from suicide as people's only way out. A lot of these residents are FMGs in New York from other countries. They're here on visa. Their visa is attached to a hospital, the very hospital that might be having them work these excessively long shifts and during the pandemic. Some of these people are not used to having any failures in their life. So when they can't keep up, they consider it a personal defect. And without the ability to ask for help and not have, especially if they're foreign medical graduates, they don't have their family in this country. It's very isolating, lonely, can create a scenario in which somebody feels so much despair that their only way out, they can't go home to their family and feel like they'll be accepted if they quit. Their only way out for some people is suicide. It's just terrible.
Absolutely. And I think the stats are almost 300 to 400 physicians we lose in America every year, which is a couple classes of medical school students, which is insane to think about.
300 to 400 per year is probably an underestimate, and that's just physicians who die by suicide in the United States. The average medical school class, I think I read somewhere, was 126. This isn't even including the medical students that die, but just the physicians that die every year in this country could fill up an entire medical school. And nobody's tracking medical students that die by suicide.
You hear stories of all the time about physicians walking in with IVs as emergency room doctors. And that's just sad. People should be able to take days off, especially when they're sick or have a family emergency.
Doctors are working while they're ill, dehydrated. They've got IVs in and they're working on the wards, delivering babies. After delivering their own baby, they're back delivering other babies. They don't even get maternity leave. Some of them are only off for a few days. People are having miscarriages at work due to the overwork.
Who has the best work ethic? The doctor who does 9 surgeries while injected with a painkiller for appendicitis? Or the cardiologist who vomits 4 pints of blood after a 64-hour shift? The pulmonologist running an ICU during a life-threatening asthma attack? Or the orthopedist who completes a total hip replacement during active labor? The new intern on NICU with a hemoglobin of 6? Or the OB who has an MI during a C-section, then heads down the hall for a cardiac cath and bypass? The nocturnist vomiting all night before his own admission for acute renal failure? Or the OB who delivers her baby and gets up 2 hours later to deliver twins? Maybe it's the dehydrated ED doc on a 24-hour shift with a fractured pelvis, doubled over in pain from gallstones, who lands in the OR after never calling in sick in 18 years. There is no winner when we work our doctors to death. Stop glorifying physician self-abuse while mandating self-care.
I heard of a Stanford medical student that died a couple months ago recently, and it's tragic, and there should be more research and data into this. How does this hierarchy affect people's well-being once we're in the system?
They keep promising it'll get better next year. Just hold on and wait till residency will get better. Third year will be better than second year. Really, it doesn't get better for a lot of people. And our mental health issues can just get worse if they're not dealt with proactively. I feel like a lot of people just feel trapped almost like a cul-de-sac. They can't get out. They can't quit because they have the student loans, feel absolutely desperate. And I do want to say that you have so many more options than you can think of. I'm helping somebody right now as a second-year medical student. He might quit. He doesn't see the value in continuing. He can open his own coaching practice, his own health practice. You can have your own clinic. Even if you leave residency after your first year, you can be licensed as a physician and have your own practice. In the last 16 years or so, I've helped about 600 doctors unleash themselves from this Titanic that is assembly line big box medicine, causing havoc in patients' lives because you're not really getting a solution. They just put band-aids and have you churning back through for more revenue generation. It's not about healing. It's about pills, surgeries, no holistic sense of really getting to the root of people's problems.
That's just really sad to think about, and something we're seeing more of, I feel like, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, people considering scaling back to part-time work or leaving entirely in different stages. How come premeds aren't told of this? So we touched a little bit about suicide, but maybe you can talk more about other conditions medical students can develop, which they may not have had before. Anxiety and depression, problem sleeping, things like that.
And also using drugs. Like a lot of them are just starting in with caffeine, Red Bull, taking Adderall, very toxic. A situation in which people are literally, their telomeres are shredding at 6 times the rate the general public, meaning they're aging 6 times as fast in 1 year as they would be if they weren't an intern. That's what the study was done on interns. They've lost their lives. They've lost connections with their family members. It's isolating. It's almost, some people have described it as a cult. I've actually categorized about 43 different human rights violations that are common in medical training, not only sleep deprivation, but like food and water deprivation. You can't get out of the surgery for 6 hours. You're dehydrated. You have skipped all these meals. You don't see your family, bullying, hazing, all sorts of things that go on. It's just terrible.
I've had medical students, friends all over this country, and we talk all the time about how people misuse alcohol and drugs and sleep aids in order to just get through the day. And that's not even including the crazy high caffeine concentration we intake.
Well, when you're basically thrown to the bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just trying to be able to go to the bathroom, eat dinner, drink, sleep, this is a chronic human rights violation scenario that lasts throughout medical school, in residency, where people are not able to take care of their bodily needs for fluids, food. They can't sleep. Some people have lifelong sleeping problems as a result of just trying to make it through residency. And a level of hypervigilance and fear, the perfectionism and feeling like you have to always be alert and always ready at any moment to help somebody else. Meanwhile, your entire physiology cannot cope with this.
There is sometimes abuse and harassment in this field. And I feel like that's something that also gets shoved underneath the rug, but people experience it. And I think the statistics by AMA said 1 out of 3 medical students experience pimping of some sort during these 7 to 9 years or so of training.
There's a level of almost institutional betrayal that happens. I wrote this free ebook. It's downloadable from my website, Physician Betrayal, How Our Heroes Become Villains. And essentially, we are in a betrayal cycle with each other in which we are once victims, and then when we rise into a teaching position or as an attending, we can become perpetrators, continuing the legacy of the poor medical education that we once experienced. Just like any other abuse relationship, incest or domestic abuse, violence, you end up caught up in a victim perpetrator cycle. Until you're able to identify this cycle, it will repeat itself over and over again, and we could very sadly become the instruments to perpetuate this abuse on future generations. Residents can abuse like the interns, and the attendings are screaming at the residents. Just read a little section here about institutional betrayal, which happens when a medical institution is deliberately disloyal to their stated values of easing suffering and preserving life. Medical schools, clinics, and hospitals may mislead, deceive, and breach the faith of trainees and physicians, causing harm through coercion, lack of informed consent, hypocrisy, all sorts of abuse and bullying and all of that. And so institutional betrayal trauma occurs when the trusted medical institution that teaches trainees how to be healers fails to protect them and can so deeply contradict what is expected that the medical professionals end up blocking their trauma in order to maintain the attachment with their profession. And I think you see this all the time, is that medical students and residents have to give up almost their moral code to continue to be attached to a profession that actually has abused them and even their patients. They've seen very unethical things happening, especially today. It's pretty rampant. And then there is this condition that will arise. This answers your question, like, why doesn't anyone talk about this? Well, betrayal blindness is a state of denial among physicians in which they do not allow themselves to see what is happening because the information would threaten their professional standing and worldview. When physicians or medical students blind themselves to the betrayal and fear of future betrayals, the act helps them survive in a career and a medical education environment that they believe they can't escape. Betrayal blindness is a coping mechanism leading doctors to literally dissociate en masse. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that. And everyone who's listening to this should go get a copy of your book because I think it's so insightful and it's something we need to pay more attention to. Also know of one friend who walked into an OR room and the surgeon threw a scalpel at her head. Luckily, it didn't hit her, but it went right past her shoulder. She was just telling me how terrified she was that day. She didn't feel safe there, but she felt like she didn't have any other option but to keep her head down. And so stories like this, too sad that it's happening in this profession and it shouldn't be happening, but it is. And so hopefully more awareness can bring about a solution to this issue.
Yeah, talking about this is definitely the first step. It's very hard to solve a problem if nobody knows it exists. And it's kind of like incest or anything else. If everyone's keeping the secret, how are we going to stop it?
So here's another thing to talk about. I feel like anyone who either aspires to be in medical school or actually gets in, we're typically bright, motivated, hardworking students. You kind of have the same basic tendencies and characteristics. And yet within a couple of weeks, I feel medical students all across need to put on a kind of like an armor or an image to other colleagues, especially when they're struggling either academically or even emotionally, which makes them even more vulnerable to, suicide and clinical depression. But again, these people don't reach out for help or admit that they're feeling these things on the inside. And so why is that?
The main reason that we are feeling dehumanized, which I think is what you're talking about, severed from our heart and soul in this medical training, is because there's a foundational flaw in Western medical training. Reductionism, if you're familiar with that, means essentially we look at human beings as really interesting biological machines, and your heart and soul is not, it's the opposite of holistic medicine, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so I have a thing that I wrote on reductionist medicine and the dangers of reductionist medicine. Reductionism is the opposite of holism. Holistic medicine treats patients as whole people, mind, body, and soul inseparable, rather than symptoms or diseases. So if you can imagine, In reductionist medicine, we are looking at people for how interesting their diseases are and not necessarily encouraged to connect with them culturally, look at the whole family, look at their lifestyle. We're just looking at these diseases and wanting to do surgeries and throw medications at them in 7-minute visits. And so holistic healing, essentially, when holistic healers care for people, which I think a lot of medical students go into medicine thinking that they're going to get more of a holistic education, but they actually don't, by and large. I mean, all over the medical school websites, it could say holistic, whole person care, but when the rubber meets the road, they're in a memorization, regurgitation style learning with no time for self-care. And then, if there's no time for self-care, you can't take care of yourself. You can't give others what you don't have, right? And so I think really what we need is a more holistic model, which is integrating the whole and maintaining the delicate balance within the ecosystem of life, right? Rather than tearing down living systems into tiny pieces, which is what reductionism does. So the goal of holism is to heal the parts to maintain the whole. The goal of reductionism is to tear down the whole to treat the parts. Holism believes the whole has greater value than the sum of the parts. Reductionism believes that the tiniest parts, especially when patented and monetized, has greater value than the whole. So what's happening in reduction is we're holding the whole person hostage to its tiny parts, now owned by reductionist medicine, and that assures dependency on the doctor and the medical system. Medical students really don't want to be in 7-minute visits just doling out pills and potions to people. They really want to approach their patients in a holistic manner. But the economics of medical practice and big box assembly line medicine and the sort of medical education model that we have now that forces us into this old style of regurgitation, memorization, test taking, multiple choice, it doesn't allow us to be human beings or relate to our patients as human beings.
Absolutely. And I'd have to agree with everything that you just said. And, we learn so much at an inhuman speed as the years go by. Medical education just increases in volume. So we're consuming more and more material every single year.
You know what they told us in med school? They said that they didn't expect us to remember 90% of what we learn. We were supposed to forget. So then you're like, oh, is this like a weeding out process? So all these tests, we're not even expected to retain this. It's just, that's even another layer of abuse, right?
It kind of defeats the purpose. Ultimately, we're there to learn and ultimately become great clinicians to do what's best for the patient. And yet all of these things are missing from the current education and training model today. And that needs to change. Tuition rates. I think that's another thing people may not be aware of. If you compare our generation, which is my generation, to the previous ones, that they've just skyrocketed over the past years, which is resulting in a ridiculous debt load. So maybe you can offer some insight into that.
When I went to medical school, it was one of the cheaper medical schools in the country, UTMB in Galveston, Texas, and my tuition was $5,600 a year, like $22,000 of loans when I graduated, and I paid them off during my first or second year of residency on a residence salary. Now, students, especially if they're dating other medical students, can you imagine you're in a medical marriage and you both have a total of over $500,000 of student loans or more? I met a couple that had like $800,000 student debt, a married medical student couple.
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, that's quite a lot. And I think the 2020 to 2021 AAMC tuition and fees comparison said that the average private medical school cost about $63,989 dollars a year. And, for some schools, it can go all the way up to $81,000 a year, especially if you're going to osteopathic schools or private medical schools in this country. So it's crazy. And I think that's why in our generation, people tend to fear leaving it more because they're financially not able to, especially at the end of the first year of training itself. I've had so many of my colleagues, if it only hadn't been for the finances, I would have considered something else, but they had already sunk so much money into this, and not a lot of people are privileged enough to step away.
Like financial blackmail situation or something. They're held hostage. Every medical school should really have a career counseling office to help people there should be an off-ramp, legitimate off-ramp where you're offered multiple options to reroute your career. Because otherwise, these are young people who, without an off-ramp, are choosing suicide as their off-ramp. Or they're staying in a profession that makes them miserable, which is maybe worse than suicide. It's like living a life that sucks permanently.
Absolutely. And I guess something else needs to be addressed is that, it's very common, except people don't talk about it, that you can fail blocks in medical school. And when you end up failing an X number amount, they'll either make you repeat the school year or the semester, depending on where you go. But that means you need to shell that equal amount of money again.
Yeah, so you're paying 5 years of medical school.
Yeah, so that tends to worsen the problem for, I think, a lot of people, no matter where you're going, whether it's a DO or University of Michigan. MD schools.
People who go to those Caribbean schools, international medical grads get into the US. So they go to school in Grenada or somewhere else, but they're US citizens. And they have some of those schools have a 75% attrition rate. You're basically going to get all the debt and have nothing to show for it.
Absolutely. And I think that's really prevalent, not to stereotype, but in Asian cultures, just to send their kids off to Caribbean medical schools just for that degree, but no one ever thinks about whether they should stay on that path or not. And especially with the attrition rate, it's criminal. You're wasting a lot of money if you're not going to be able to, quote unquote, tough it out, even though you're given subpar education, subpar living models there. Nothing really to help you really succeed in the profession. So it just seems at times predatory.
I mean, I had an FMG recently tell me that she equates the whole FMG, and the difference between IMG and FMG is foreign medical graduates are non-US citizens, and so they need a visa that's held by the hospital that often is working them to the bone and possibly where they're experiencing bullying and hazing and other issues. This woman told me she equates this with human trafficking. I mean, she said it meets the definition for human trafficking. Like they could leave, but they really can't. So they don't know a way out. And so then often they are just feeling tormented, trapped, and some die by suicide.
Absolutely. So let's talk about a couple more things that tie into this issue. So how about this bottleneck effect of residencies? Because that's also an issue here where you get thousands of unmatched medical students, whether you're in the US or an FMG. The people aren't just finding residency spots. And I know that happened to a couple of friends of mine this year. So how did it get that way? And why is this such an issue here?
There's not apparently enough funding from Congress through, I think, Medicare to cover the number of people that would like to become physicians and who graduate from medical school and pass all their tests. Isn't it shocking to a pre-med to realize that you could go through all of medical school and then not match and have a degree that you can't use clinically to actually provide care for people? And the way I would redo this is I feel like, first of all, these unmatched medical trainees should be allowed to actually work even part-time to help out some of these overworked current interns and residents. A lot of residents don't actually need the number of years of training they're getting to do what they want to do, like outpatient family medicine. Why should I do 2 months in the NICU? These people are being used as cheap labor, and unless you're going to be a hospitalist, a brain surgeon, orthopedic surgeon, you need a certain number of cases in the hospital. A lot of what they're doing in the hospital may have no relevance to what they want to do outpatient. More opportunity for people to do 1-year internships and go out and launch their independent ideal practices without having to complete residency. Then we'd have a lot more slots opening up for more people who are unmatched to get in if they're qualified. And there's just a lot of ways of actually fixing this, but it requires creativity and sort of breaking out of the predatory model of, paying people essentially less than minimum wage, some of them for working 2 to 3 full-time jobs if you count the number of hours they work per week.
Such a systemic issue. We can only hope that things get better in the future. But for now, everyone in training hope that you match at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's really sad. But don't, lose your life. Definitely reach out. I know a lot of things people can do if they're unmatched or they quit residency or med school. Like, it's not worth your life. Do not give up your life to this profession. Do not end up feeling like you're forced to do something that's against your will, against your ethics. This is your life, and you should never be forced to submit to abuse.
Thank you so much for that. And hopefully that makes an impact to everyone who needs to hear it and whoever is going to be listening to this in the future as well, because that's so important. Especially for, women physicians as well. That doesn't get talked about. As a woman in this career, you're juggling family life more than the male counterpart. And sometimes that additional stress takes a toll on you. I think about 40 to 45%, I believe. I think about 40. And recent studies showed that women physicians in this field either leave or scale back to part-time work within a couple of years post-residency.
Yep. I mean, how are you going to raise a toddler and be pregnant or deliver twins? Or how are you? How can you do that if you're working, 80 hours a week? It's just impossible.
About for-profit medical schools, including the ones in America and also Caribbean models, how come this kind of education model is allowed to exist, and how come they're getting away with subpar education?
That's a good question. And I don't know that I have the answer to that, but it's definitely happening because I'm hearing from people who have exorbitant amount of loans. They're having to, especially during the pandemic with isolation, they can't even go on campus. You know what I mean? They're having to learn on their own at a distance, literally by buying their own courses to learn how to prep for their board tests. Like they don't even feel like they're well equipped from their medical school to pass their mandatory tests they need to pass to even graduate. So if you're having to pay for your own education outside of your medical school tuition, and you're not getting on-site learning, and you're not getting proper mentorship, like what are you paying for?
Absolutely. And I remember a couple years back, I think about 2017, I believe it was the Ross University School of Medicine, which is pretty big. Students usually go to Ross or St. George's from America. People at Ross ended up actually taking classes on a cruise ship when their medical school was destroyed.
Right. They had that storm or whatever. And so let's all move on to a cruise ship, right?
Horrible living conditions and education right there. And a lot of students, as you said before, fail out, which then again leads to feeling like a failure, feeling incompetent, and this massive debt load, and feeling like you can't do anything else in your life.
It's a terrible business model. Hold our young people hostage to their dreams, right? And bank on the fact, literally bankroll off their naivete, take advantage of our young people's humanitarian nature.
Absolutely. So let's take a moment to talk about residency now. Like we talked about medical school and all these kind of conditions that can develop, and that's 4 years of intense training you're going through. And then after you match, hopefully you come to residency, which can be anywhere from 3 to a couple of years, 7 or 8 or more possibly. But I don't think a lot of people are aware of how chronically sleep deprived they are. So why should people care about that? And why is that such a problem?
So if you're up more than 17 hours working, it's the equivalent of having legally the psychomotor retardation of somebody that would be pulled over for a DUI, like you're basically drunk. And so some of these doctors are on shifts that are like 28 hours. And so why would you have them running ICUs and running ventilators when they literally can't even drive a car without, like a lot of people, not a lot, but there's a subset of people who get in car crashes and even die on the way home after their shifts from the hospital. That's how unsafe these working conditions are. Like you're basically filling the hospital with drunk doctors that get paid approaching or less than minimum wage residents. Yeah. Some of them whose visas are attached to the hospital and they can't get out without being deported. It's a nightmare.
And that's an additional issue that we've seen here, with the visa attached. And that's just terrible because, you're not exactly present when you're at home because you're thinking about work, and then you come to work, and how can you be an excellent physician like you're hoping to be if you're sleep deprived? No one can function without adequate sleep.
Correct. And it's chronic. It's not just 1 year. It's not like going to war where it's like you've got to like run a marathon for a week or two. I mean, this is like 7 years. This is 7 years of or more. There was a father who called me about his son who was suicidal as a neurosurgery resident, and he wanted to know like what he should do. I'm like, you need to get down there with him and stay with him. And he should consider leaving his program. Because I interview doctors who've survived their suicide attempts. I asked them like, how long after you decided to pick up the gun or the scalpel or overdose or whatever did you actually begin the act to kill yourself? It's like 3 to 5 minutes. This is an impulsive decision that people make in a state of extreme hopelessness. And it takes a lot for like a perfectionist young male medical student to admit to his father that he's suicidal. And I think everyone needs to take it very seriously whenever a medical trainee is asking for help. They probably needed help years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And considering a lot of them are A-type personality, hard for them to come out and admit that to someone. So it's tough. It's definitely tough. I think the issue is people just think that it's a couple of years of hard work and you get rewarded as the status of a physician and the high salaries and such, but I think people miss out on the gravity of how all these years of training can take an effect on you physically and emotionally, and the price of that as a human being, and your ability to connect with not only other people and your family, but also yourself at times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You completely lose connection with your heart and soul. And some people by the end can't even remember what their dreams were that led them into medical school.
And I think, that's where disillusionment occurs, which unfortunately, along with the high burnout rates, that's been occurring more and more over the years.
Understand that term burnout, because burnout really blames the victim as being unable to keep up with something that you would assume would be a safe working environment. This is very different. These are hazardous working conditions that are chronic human rights violations. Not letting somebody sleep and forcing them to work for 28 hours is a human rights violation. Not letting people get mental health care without punishing them and breaching their confidentiality is breaching their human rights. Okay. And so the bullying, hazing, all of this, it is absolutely should be illegal. And these are crimes against the humanity of our humanitarians who we would want to help the rest of us.
Each year, our best and brightest, most compassionate students enter medicine, a career with the highest suicide rate of any profession. Each year, more than 1 million Americans lose their doctors to suicide. Jumping from hospital rooftops, found hanging in hospital chapels. Classic response: blame the victim. Then cover up the suicide with medicine's favorite victim-blaming buzzword, burnout. A slang word from the 1970s for end-stage drug addiction, now weirdly applied to doctors. Here's how it works. Physician burnout blames the victim, not the medical system that actually kills doctors and patients. Plus, it's a cash cow for physician predators and profiteers, all the burnout coaches cannibalizing the corpses of their colleagues. Divided and conquered by bullying, hazing, and sleep deprivation, the foundation of medical training that forces new med school grads to legally work 28-hour shifts, treating heart attacks, gunshot victims, and delivering stillborns with no debriefing for their trauma. No bathroom breaks. No time to eat. Surgeons collapse from dehydration and hypoglycemia. Here's a doc found sleeping on an elderly comatose woman while starting her IV. All true stories. An ICU doc forced to keep working during a seizure. Another doctor working while miscarrying her baby. These human rights violations lead to suicide and families destroyed by suicide. Plus, lifelong physician PTSD, anxiety, depression, divorce, strokes, and heart attacks when our doctors are legally forced to work 80, 100, even 120 hours per week. That's 2 to 3 full-time jobs. Criminal in Japan, where companies are held liable for suicides when employees work just 60 hours per week. Now, doctors are standing up against the abuse. So hospitals are retaliating with forced wellness on the overworked, with mandatory 6 a.m. sleep deficiency lectures after 24-hour shifts, and mandatory resilience training for military doctors with crayons and adult coloring books. FYI, appointing chief wellness officers while perpetuating abuse is like putting a Band-Aid on a ruptured aorta. Enough burnout bullshit, guys. Claim responsibility for human rights violations at your medical institution. Stop abusing your staff, then apologize to victims and their families. And if you're being abused, please leave your abuser, who may, in fact, be your burnout coach keeping you caged in your cubicle.
And you brought up a really great point, Dr. Weibel, because that's so important. Learning to place where the problem is accurately will only get the solutions that we're going to need in the future. I think right now, all the solutions have been diverted to the individual level, whether we should be having it on a more systemic level. So I 100% agree with that.
When you say the solutions are pointed at the individual, so you're talking about like meditation, yoga, like
Yes.
Sleep hygiene lectures for people after their 28-hour shifts, that is blaming the individual when the perpetrators, the hospital systems, the clinics, the administrators are the ones at the helm of enforcing, if not, hand in hand, somewhat creating these unworkable environments that actually harm their own staff and should be illegal.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that. So let's talk about the next thing, which is therapy. How come med students and anyone in this profession fear getting therapy when you're in a field that exposes you to so much trauma and death and all these crazy, horrific conditions that most people aren't subject to on a regular basis?
So because when they apply for hospital privileges or their medical license, there's often a question on there that asks you about your mental health and whether you've sought psychiatric care. Very tiny bottom line, small font before you sign. You're literally releasing your supposedly HIPAA protected medical records to the medical board so they can actually read about all your struggles. And this varies from state to state. And I did a peer review article called Physician Friendly States for Mental Health. And it reviews all the different medical board licensing applications for initial licensees and all the 50, some states in the US. So the thing is, it might be different elsewhere and renewal applications can be a little bit different. But the point is, you're having your personal protected health information displayed to the public. And so that's why people fear going in and sharing what's going on with them with a psychiatrist. They don't want it in EMR. They don't want it to be discoverable. They also don't have time or money sometimes to even get to these appointments. So there are a lot of hurdles, and this should really be on-the-job support that our medical professionals get that is non-punitive and absolutely confidential and never leaked back to your program director or to your employer.
Yeah, this needs to change for sure. How come current physicians are labeling the current practice of medicine and healthcare as broken? I think we briefly touched on this, but it's way more reasons than what we just talked about. And I was hoping you could share some insight into that.
From a patient's perspective, they're getting like 7-minute visits, 10-minute visits in assembly line clinics and big box medicine that has a high overhead. That's like, I don't know, my last job was 74% overhead, my last employed job. And so that meant I was running around in circles trying to take care of people. I saw 5,400 patients a year on a 194-day contract, 54 separate patient visits in a year, and 4,004 of those went to pay for overhead. So just look at that model. That's a high overhead model in which I'm being forced to see people for very short visits just to pay for the giant building and the overhead and all this. It's just ridiculous. So I think part of it is that we're all sort of hooked up to the Titanic and we need to jump off into our life rafts, whether you're leaving the medical profession or creating your own ideal clinic in alignment with the values that you had when you entered this profession. But I think some people just end up sucked into these high overhead, which with high overhead, you have to push high volume. With high volume of patients, you're pushing poor standard of care because you can't possibly help somebody in a 7-minute visit when they're crying and having a crisis, right? So literally you're giving people terrible assembly line medical care. You are, trapped in this high overhead, high volume practice. You feel like an imposter. You're not helping people. You feel like you're actually, a lot of doctors who die on the suicide registry feel like they've been swept up into criminal rings in hospitals and clinics, and they're not able to actually be a real healer. And so they just off themselves because they don't want to be an accomplice to what some of these organizations are doing.
I think that just is like a huge problem that, people need to be aware of, because you only see one side of the medical profession when all of these other things are going on as well. Which leads me to ask, how come physicians are leaving the field at various stages? Because I have met people who left in the preclinical years, the clinical years. Some dropped in residency, some dropped 5 to 10 years out from residency. You see companies and organizations popping up specifically to cater to these people. Other physicians are becoming wellness coaches to help with this problem. And you're starting to see this is becoming more and more common these days. And people are going back to the non-clinical world or switching to other fields entirely?
Well, I think there's a lot of doctors that just want to jump off whenever they can, including med students. So there's probably more med students leaving. There's people that are definitely leaving residency and getting licenses to practice in various states after 1 year of internship. There are doctors, like I just had 2 or 3 doctors in the last week who are anesthesiologists who are jumping ship because they can't stand the toxic work environment in hospitals and are not going to submit to the mandate and other sorts of things. And they want to have control over their destiny. And so they're launching their own practices. So yeah, there's just a big mutiny from the Titanic that is literally just trying to dictate what we need to do. And it is criminal. We're not able to practice in alignment with our values. Some of us aren't even able to make decisions about what to put in our bodies and how long we work. I mean, it's just terrible how much power these organizations have wielded over our healers.
Absolutely. And, you know, the couple of physicians I spoke to, a lot of them cited the lack of the work-life balance as their ultimate deciding factor to switch, because no one felt like they were getting enough time with their families or their kids. And while you could push through the education in your 20s, other things in your life will become more and more important as you age to a certain degree, because that is also important, and balance is important for everyone to have. Talk about physicians' salary. I think people already kind of know that physicians have one of the highest salaries in this country, but they probably are not aware of that the reimbursements are decreasing over there. So maybe you could talk to us about that issue.
Reimbursement is going down. In some areas, you're getting reimbursed pretty terribly for the work that you put in. And then if you have the high overhead, like I had 74% overhead at my last employed job, which meant that if I brought in $100 per patient, like I was only getting paid $26 for a visit. And then that's before taxes. But if you can imagine, if you have a high overhead office that's getting reimbursed poorly by Medicare or commercial insurance, then you're literally, like in my last job, 74% overhead. That's like moving to a state with 74% income tax. Like, would you live somewhere where 74% of the revenue you generate is just absconded and they run off with it as overhead? I mean, that's insane, right? Who would do that?
No, I would not be choosing that option.
Doctors are doing this all the time. The majority of doctors are at high overhead, high volume offices, and they don't really understand what's happening. That 3/4 of the money they earn is just being lost as overhead to the organization. They never do the math. You know, they're too busy to do the math, so they just stay stuck.
Absolutely. And for those listeners out there, keep in mind, this is what today's tuition rates. So you're going to take an extra long time to pay off your debts if you actually finish medical school. That's another thing to consider. Mm-hmm. So another thing I wanted to pivot back to was female physicians. I know we touched on this briefly, but I was hoping you can talk to us about some of the more unique challenges that female counterparts tend to face in the workplace that males do not as much.
I think women are just more relational by nature. And so it really harms us emotionally and spiritually when we can't connect with our patients, and when we certainly can't spend time with our kids and our husbands, our infants, our spouses, whatever. And so it's really tough on women. It's tough on men too. I think there's a lot of men who are more, at least in primary care, there's a subset of men, I think, who are just more tender-hearted, empathic. Those of us who have high empathy, like the sensitive people, we're often mistreated by the people who are maybe the program directors that have a more militaristic style of training. They don't really care for soft-spoken, sweet introverts. They'd rather have, the bulliers. There's like a bullying that goes on in training, and some of these bulliers feel like they're actually doing us a service by weeding out the sensitive, loving, empathic type doctors. And so I think what happens to women is they absolutely end up becoming what I call masculinized. They absolutely have to start speaking without like tenderness and without like fluffy love type words. And they have to be able to they almost go sort of monotone male, and in order to talk about graphs and charts and stay in that super tentorial, reductionist zone that is not their nature. I think we end up with a lot of bitter, masculinized women in medicine who then, sadly, because I hear from other women who expect that they would be treated well by their female superiors, there's a subset of female superiors who then actually bully females below them in training. And there's a level of viciousness, I think, that women can dole out sometimes to other women in medicine, which is really, really sad and not our innate nature.
Why do you think people are more interested in the idealistic nature of the medical profession rather than the reality? Because I'll now share my own perspective here. I remember, as someone who spent almost all of her life doing science and research, medical school just seemed like the ideal next step. It made the most sense. I loved the environment. And yet I can tell you with absolute certainty that it was not until I actually started medical school I realized what the reality of the profession was. And this is despite being in the hospital for like over 150 hours, just shadowing someone and being in clinics and all these other things that premeds are doing today. And yet we still do not understand as a premed or even parents of medical students exactly what this field is.
So sometimes I don't think you can understand something until you're in it. It's kind of like eating an apple. You can explain what it's like, but you don't really know what it tastes like till you put one in your mouth. It's like marriage. At the beginning, everyone's idealistic and in love until death do us part. And then, a few years in, when the stress arises and there's infidelity, I think there's unexpected turmoil in a lot of pieces of our life that we idealize. And part of this that is exacerbated by youth. A lot of people who are young, teenagers, early 20s, you don't have the life experience necessarily. And some people just feel like a little immortal at that young age, or almost like they can handle anything. I think it's a combination of youthful idealism, lack of real experience in medical settings that are scary if you have not witnessed bullying. As a resident, I think as a pre-med, you don't necessarily get exposed to some of the more horrific things that can happen in the hospital. Part of this is that it's human nature. Patients want to idealize doctors and think they have all the answers. Families want to believe that having a physician child is like this trophy prize type thing. I don't know. There's a certain pedestal that physicians are on, and it's reinforced by their family, by religion, by culture, by youth, by television shows. And so by the time you figure out that you're falling off the pedestal, it's really painful and you don't have a lot of support.
Absolutely. And from my experience, I feel like a lot of pressure that parents tend to put on their kids is coming from a lack of awareness of all these other issues. So they only see one side of the story. They're missing the complete other side and only focusing on the status and the salary, quote unquote.
And even just kind of this whole notion of they want their family members to follow in their footsteps and be physicians too. There's all these families that are like, well, everyone in our family is a physician, the grandparents and parents and our uncles, and of course you're going to be one too. And that's so damaging to the soul of your child who has another destiny that might not be medicine. I mean, the one thing I'll never forget is somebody I know who was very active in physician suicide prevention ended up posting a picture of her newborn child with the hashtag future doctor. And I'm like, that's part of the problem and you should know better. Why would you be instilling that into your newborn or toddler, that they should be a doctor? I mean, this is so ingrained. It's just hard to break the cycle.
Yeah. And hopefully, our generation can do just that, because the next generation shouldn't have to be dealing with all of the stress, all of the issues that we just talked about. And I think there just needs to be awareness in society, both for the kids and for the parents who are taking on these tuition debt loads, to be aware, medicine has changed the last couple of years, and it's making it harder and harder for physicians at any point to continue staying in this field. But, hopefully this will raise awareness today. And I just want to thank you so much for spending the time with me today and answering all my questions patiently. And I hope that this can really help someone.
Yes, thank you so much for being willing to ask your questions on a video. I have a lot of conversations with people that are very intense, that go on for an hour. I think hundreds or thousands of other people would have loved to hear what we talked about. So thank you so much for being willing to go public with your questions.